When Grandpa passed away, it wasn't a shock. He'd been sick for a while, living alone in that big, old house miles from the nearest town. We knew it was only a matter of time. Still, when we got the call 2 weeks after he had died, something inside me sank. Sadness mixed with an odd sense of relief. It felt like the end of something long and drawn out, but also like the final chapter of a book you weren't quite ready to finish. The police said he died from dehydration, of all things. The house was stocked with supplies, so it didn't make sense at first. Then they explained the power had gone out, and the water pump stopped working. He must have gotten confused and flipped the breaker, but he couldn't fix it. The idea of Grandpa wandering around the house, lost in his own mind, struggling to figure out why things weren't working, made my heart ache. It was no way for anyone to go, especially not him. I had just graduated from college with a liberal arts degree. I wasn't exactly swimming in job offers, so when my parents told me they didn't want Grandpa's house and didn't want to rent it out either, I hesitated. It was a huge house, bigger and nicer than anything I could afford, but the idea of living there alone unsettled me. Still, the thought of paying rent somewhere else when a perfectly good house was just sitting there empty didn't make sense. After weeks of thinking it over, I finally decided to move in. The house was a bit of a drive from the nearest town, tucked away behind winding roads and surrounded by endless fields. It was isolated, and even though I didn't want to admit it, that made me nervous. Luckily, I didn't have to move in alone. My brother Ben had just gone through a rough breakup with his girlfriend. He needed a place to stay for a while, so he offered to come with me. I couldn't say no. Having someone else there made the idea of living in Grandpa's house a little easier to handle. The house itself was something out of an old photograph. It had this worn, rustic charm to it, like the kind of place that's been passed down through generations. The floors creaked underfoot, and the wood-paneled walls had a slight bow to them, as if they'd been holding up the weight of memories for decades. The air inside was always cool, even in the summer, and there was a faint scent of old books and something I couldn't quite place, like the musty smell of time. When Ben and I first moved in, we didn't bring much with us. Just the essentials: a couple of mattresses, a TV, some clothes, and my old gaming console. The house didn't need much in terms of repairs. Grandpa had always been good at keeping things in working order, right up until the end. The upstairs bedroom, where they'd found him, had been cleared out by the police. Even though it was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that the space still held a presence. I wasn't about to sleep up there. That much was certain. We spent the first night in the house trying to settle in. After hauling all our stuff inside, Ben and I were exhausted, but neither of us wanted to go to bed just yet. We set up the TV in the living room, hooked up my old gaming console, and played a few rounds of a racing game to unwind. The room had this strange stillness to it. The only light came from the screen, casting long shadows across the walls. Every so often, I'd glance toward the hallway that led to the stairs, expecting to see anything move, but nothing did. Ben broke the silence after a while. "Weird being here, huh?" he said, his eyes still on the game. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It feels different." We didn't talk about Grandpa that night. It felt like a subject too heavy to bring up, especially with the house still holding so many of his things. Even though he'd become distant and confused in the months before he died, Grandpa had been a brilliant man. He started a successful software company back in the day, and even though he'd retired years ago, his mind was always sharp until it wasn't. I couldn't help but think about that last phone call. About a month before he passed, Grandpa called us late one night. His voice had this strange, far-off quality to it. He told us he'd seen the devil standing under an apple tree when he was a kid. He sounded so sure of it, so convinced that it was a memory, not some figment of his deteriorating mind. After that call, we didn't hear from him again. As the night dragged on, Ben eventually called it quits and headed to bed. I stayed up for a little while longer, staring at the flickering TV screen, but not really watching. My mind kept drifting back to the house, to Grandpa, to the silence that pressed in from all sides. The next morning, Ben and I started moving in more of our stuff. Ben had brought his 2 computers, a bunch of paperbacks, and for some reason, a treadmill he insisted we'd use. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't argue. As we unpacked, the house started to feel a little more lived in, but it still didn't feel like home. After a few hours, we decided to take a trip into town to pick up groceries and supplies. The drive there was uneventful, but on the way back, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. The air felt different, thicker somehow. And then, as we pulled up to the house, I realized what was bothering me. There were no birds, no sounds of wildlife. Just an eerie, heavy silence. "Ben, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" he replied, looking at me with a confused expression. "Exactly. There's nothing to hear. No birds. No wind. Nothing." He chuckled and shook his head. "You're overthinking it. Maybe the birds are just hiding from us." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press the issue. We walked inside, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. Ben didn't seem bothered. He grabbed a soda from the fridge and settled in front of his computer, diving into whatever classwork he had to catch up on. Meanwhile, I sat on the couch with the game controller in my hands, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the window, half expecting to see someone out there in the fields. But there was nothing, just the empty expanse of land and the line of trees in the distance. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the oppressive silence outside. No crickets, no wind, not even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was like the world outside had been muted, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Finally, I got up and opened the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that would break the stillness. But there was nothing. No flicker of fireflies, no stars twinkling in the sky, just darkness. I closed the window and crawled back into bed, my heart beating faster than it should have. That night, I dreamt of Grandpa, but it wasn't the version of him I remembered from my childhood, the strong, sharp-witted man who could solve any problem. In my dream, he was a withered, decaying figure. His skin was dry and cracked, like the pages of an old book left in the sun too long. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows that seemed to hold the weight of something unspeakable. He stood in front of me, silent, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I tried to speak to him, to ask what was wrong, but my voice wouldn't come. All I could do was watch as he slowly reached out a bony hand, his fingers trembling, as if trying to warn me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, and for a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. But then the familiar creaks of the old house brought me back to reality. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm myself down. It was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of Grandpa's withered face, those hollow eyes staring into me, as if he knew something I didn't. The rest of the night was sleepless. Over the next few days, the dreams came more frequently. Every night, it was the same. Grandpa, decaying before my eyes, staring at me, but never speaking. It was unsettling, to say the least. But I chalked it up to stress. Moving into a house where someone had died, especially someone you loved, was bound to mess with your head. One afternoon, while Ben and I were sitting on the porch, he pointed toward the tree line at the back of the field. "I think I just saw an albino deer," he said. I looked where he was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just the dark line of trees, standing still. "You sure?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, squinting. It was right there. I couldn't see anything, but the thought of a deer didn't seem too strange. Still, something about the way Ben stared at the forest made me uneasy. It wasn't long after that when things really started to go wrong. One night, Ben and I had gone to see a movie in town. By the time we got back, it was late, close to midnight. As we pulled into the driveway, the headlights illuminated something standing near the house. At first, I thought it was a person, but as the lights hit it, I realized it wasn't human. The thing was tall, maybe 8 feet, with skin stretched tight over its bones. It looked gaunt, almost skeletal, but there was something powerful about the way it stood. Its head was tilted slightly, and its eyes were hollow, black pits. But the worst part was its mouth. It was wide open, filled with jagged, knife-like teeth. The headlights flickered off as we sat there, frozen in the truck. Neither of us moved. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear Ben's breathing next to me, shallow and fast. The creature didn't move either. It just stood there, watching us, or maybe waiting. Minutes passed, then hours. The silence outside was thick, like a heavy blanket pressing down on us. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest twitch would draw its attention. I glanced at Ben, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I realized something: the creature hadn't moved. It was like it couldn't see us. I remembered a scene from Jurassic Park, where the T-Rex couldn't see anything unless it moved. Maybe this thing was the same. Maybe that's why Grandpa had died the way he did. He must have cut off the power, and this thing had just waited. By the time the sun was fully up, the temperature in the truck was rising. Without power, the air conditioner didn't work, and the windows wouldn't roll down. I could feel sweat dripping down my neck, and my shirt stuck to my skin. Ben wiped his face, glancing at the door. "I can't take it anymore," he whispered. "Ben, don't," I said, panic rising in my throat. But he didn't listen. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. My heart pounded as I watched him crack the door open, just a few inches. The creature didn't move. Ben opened the door wider, stepping out cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. I held my breath as he closed the door behind him. He was less than 3 feet from the creature, and still, it didn't react. He took a step, then another, carefully making his way toward the house. I could see the tension in his body, every muscle coiled, ready to spring. For a moment, I thought he was going to make it. But then, his foot landed on a twig. The snap was deafening in the silence. In an instant, the creature lunged. Its speed was terrifying, crossing the distance between them in a single leap. I screamed as it knocked Ben to the ground, its claws slicing through the air like black blades. Ben's scream echoed through the night, sharp and full of agony. The next thing I remember is waking up in the truck, the engine running. I must have blacked out, or maybe my mind just couldn't process what had happened. The sun was high in the sky, and the creature was gone. Ben was gone. I backed out of the driveway, my hands shaking, my vision blurry with tears. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. No one believed me when I told them what happened. The official story is that Ben was attacked by a bear. They never found his body, just traces of blood in the field. But I know what I saw. I'll never forget that thing, standing there in the driveway, waiting. I moved out of the house the next day. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Even now, years later, I still dream of the creature. Every time, it's the same. The hollow eyes, the sharp teeth, the sound of that twig snapping. I can't explain what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for certain: something is out there, lurking behind the trees, waiting for the next person to make a mistake.